Okay, cool. Well, afternoon or morning, everyone, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from around the world today. It's really, really great to have you all here for our Crow webinar, 4 behavioural hacks, how to make your customers crack. I'm really excited to be joined by Richard Shotton today, the author of The Choice Factory. I think, Rich, I think the best way to describe it, I guess, is sort of how you apply behavioral science to marketing, right? And I think one of the write-ups on the back of your book that I like is the Haynes Manual for behavioral science, which I think is always a pretty good description of what we're going to be talking about, some of the things today. So just a quick intro to make things even more difficult. I'm called Richard, as well as you might have seen, but for today, I'll happily take on the name of Richard too for this webinar. But I'm a product experience partner at Tangent, and we started working with Rich about a year ago now, actually, to create a playbook of the ways that we use biases that Rich talks about in our work to help clients improve conversions on their site or actually go about creating brand new experiences. So I'm going to pass you over to Rich now to go through the slides. If you have questions, please just fire them in as we go. We'll either curate them all to the end and then have a good Q&A session, or we might fire a few in between. But yeah, we'll keep it very relaxed. So Rich, yeah, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the intro. So today's session is going to be how we apply behavioral science to conversion rate optimization. And if you're not familiar with this phrase, behavioral science, it's nothing complicated. Essentially, it's the study of how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. So hopefully you can see the relevance to Crow. And what Rich and I have done over the last year or so is we've put together a playbook with 10 ways in which you can use behavioral science to encourage your customers to behave in the way that you want. And what we thought we could do on this webinar is, over the next half an hour or so, is go through 4 of the themes that come out from that. So there'll be a theme around the perception of value, a theme around attracting attention, a theme around steering people's attention, and then finally a theme around how do you reduce churn. So without any further ado, I'll get straight into that first theme of how do you change people's perception of value? Now, this is a fascinating area, and I think there are 2 angles to this. There's firstly, how do you make the same price feel more palatable? And then later on, how do you make the same benefits feel larger? So in terms of that, how do you make the same price feel better value? There's an awful lot of work amongst psychologists, but I want to focus just on one idea called temporal reframing. And I've picked this idea because there's lots of evidence it works, multiple experiments, and it's really simple to apply. So I'll quickly run you through an experiment I've done, just to run you through the basic principle, and then we'll talk about some of the applications. So this experiment I did about 4 or 5 years ago, and all the data in the public domains. There's no confidences being broken here, but we recruited 500 people, and we split them into 4 cells. So we used a technique called monadic testing. And the first quarter saw a picture of a car, a description of the car, and then they were told its price in a yearly amount. So £1,668 per year. The next group saw exactly the same car, exactly the same description, but this time they saw it as a monthly price, £139. Next group, same description, same car, but a weekly price. Final group, same description, same car, but a daily price. Now, if people behaved in a fully considered manner, if they weighed up all the information about the benefits and the price and thought it through in a deep way, when we then question them as to how good value the car is, they should all give us roughly the same answer. Because if you do the mental maths, each of these prices is essentially the same if you annualize it. Now, remember, our people only saw one of these pillars. So they thought they were just weighing up the price versus the benefits. Now, when we asked them how good value they thought the car was, we saw some wildly different results. So 11% of people thought the car was great value when you have that yearly amount. It jumps to 40% for the monthly amount. It increases further for the weekly amount, and it peaks at 51% when it's displayed as a daily price. Now, this is interesting because people here are putting too much emphasis when they're evaluating the price on the headline figure, the cash amount, and too little on the unit of time. So it's like they think 12 times 4 is different from 4 times 12. Now, this is what I would call, this opportunity is what I'd call temporal reframing. If you are ever conveying a price, to take advantage of this, you want to be talking about your service or your product in the smallest possible unit of time. Now, that's actually quite different from how most brands behave. Now, you go through most subscription services, whether it's newspapers, mobile phones, and they will talk about their monthly price. This research and others like it would suggest that's a mistake. Better to talk about your daily price or your weekly price. Or it doesn't just have to be if you're a service, if you are a brand and you're selling a product, well, you can still apply this idea maybe a bit laterally. This is the Camden Hells website. Rather than talking just about their price per case, they turn it into a per can cost. Now, to me, that's an example of temporal reframing. They're taking the same underlying cost and they're making it feel more palatable. So that's one example of how you can take a well-known finding from behavioural science and, as I say, very, very simply apply it to your website. This doesn't require huge expensive changes. It's just a little tweak to how you display the price. But value, of course, isn't just price. There's two parts to value. There's how much it costs and what you get. And again, behavioural science has some interesting findings. There are experiments that suggest the same benefit or the same product can be made to appear more appealing. So one technique comes from a psychologist at the University of Southern California called Eva Morales. And for her study, back in 2005, Morales recruits a group of people who are in market for a flat, and she shows that group 10 different flats. Now, to some of those people, she says, the estate agent who created this list of flats for you, they did it in an hour and they created the list using a computer. And when that group rates the quality of the estate agent, average rating is 50 out of 100. So 50 out of 100. The next group of people that Morales shows these flats to, and remember, it's exactly the same list of flats, so there's no difference in the product, but this time she gives them a slightly different story. She says the estate agent took 9 hours to create the list, and they did it manually. And in that scenario, we see the rating of the estate agent go from 50 to 68. So what's that? 36% improvement. Exactly the same commodity, rated differently because people believe more effort had gone into it. Now, you could argue that's a logical error. What we should do as consumers, arguably, is rate things according to the inherent attributes of the product. But behavioural science isn't interested in what people should do. It's interested in what they do, what they actually do. And people don't judge value in that desiccated way, but instead they bring into account how much effort they think has gone into the product. So what Morales says here is brands shouldn't be unethical. They shouldn't invent the fact they've gone to lots of effort to create their product or their service. But she says they should be more transparent about the efforts that have already gone on, because most brands already do go to huge efforts. They just don't tell people. So be much more open about being transparent about the efforts that you've gone to in the creation of your product. It might feel like a superfluous detail, but it will increase the appreciation. There's a couple of examples, I think, of people doing this well. Firstly, you've got Dyson. Now, if you ever looked out that body copy right in the bottom, it tells people about this tale of Dyson going through 5,000 prototypes before he came up with the bagless vacuum. In a way, how many failures he's had shouldn't matter. But according to Morales, that makes the product more appealing. So if you're selling coffee, tell people about the great efforts you've gone to source the ingredients, or if you're selling any kind of food stuff, go talk about the geographical distance maybe you've undertaken to get your elements, your ingredients. That would tap into the illusion of effort. One other potential application, this actually comes from an academic study again, from Behavioural and Norton at Harvard Business School, is on a service. So they mocked up these essentially flight comparison sites. So I think they kind of rebadged an existing one, and they showed people, they got people to put in their various needs, and then the results came up. So a list of flights and the costs. And the twist was that some people got the flights immediately. Some people had a little delay added to the serving of the results. And what Behavioural and Norton found was that if you were transparent about the effort that was going on by the search engine, if you said searching Alitalia, searching Delta Airlines, searching Continental, that increased delay actually made people happier with the results. They thought the results were more comprehensive and more accurate. So to me, this is another lovely way of applying the illusion of effort. If you have to have a delay in any service, make sure you let people know what you're doing. If you do so, you'll tap into Morales' illusion of effort, and you'll make people happier with your product.
Cool. Yeah, I think one of the things that I was interested in, Rich, I know I've certainly done testing around this area, and you see it a lot actually in e-commerce sites, but the notion about precise numbers. So the fact that we perceive a round number, if that, for example, was just £2, to actually be higher than £2.05. I think the question I just wanted to ask you was around on the Mazda example that you showed earlier, actually. Can you actually layer on too many of these biases together at any one time? Is it sort of something that you could start playing around with precise numbers on there as well? What's your view on that? Can you ever do too much?
So there's absolutely an advantage in applying multiple biases. Often with experiments, certainly the ones I've done, I've tried to keep it clean, like just test one variable, makes it much, much easier. However, there is evidence that if you layer on additional biases, that you can improve effectiveness. So Google did a lovely study, decoding decisions, the messy middle. And what they showed is that if you add on multiple biases into your search copy, you've got an even better probability of switching someone to your brand rather than if you just use one. However, just because the addition of some biases can be effective, it doesn't mean it works in all circumstances. It doesn't mean that you should push that point to a ridiculous degree. I've certainly seen, and going back to the kind of travel comparison site world, I think an excessive number of biases uses. You go to a lot of those travel comparison sites and it will be only 5 hotel rooms left, 15 people looking at this right now. And it creates a very stressful experience. Now, it might be those brands know what they're doing and they recognize that they are just a conduit to a holiday, and therefore people don't care about the stress and they don't care about the experience, and it works very well. But my worry would be they are mismeasuring. They're just looking at immediate short-term sales, and they're not measuring the long-term damage to their brand. If they make the experience stressful, my guess would be people are they're less likely to come back. So I think you're right here. There is an element of art, there is an element of testing, And yeah, definitely you can improve things by adding multiple biases, but I think there are certain circumstances where you have created a stressful, pressured environment where brands should be very, very careful.
Yeah, okay, brilliant, understood.
So that was our first theme about boosting value through behavioural science. The next one is about how to attract attention. And this is one of the kind of oldest ideas in behavioural science. There's an awful lot of experimentation into how to attract someone's attention. And that's pretty important topic for any marketer. You know, on a website, we're bombarded with information. As we walk down the street, we're bombarded with information. Most of it is edited out. You know, so just getting your customers' attention is quite the achievement. But psychologists have come up with some interesting tactics. And the one that I want to discuss is a really old one called the von Restorff effect. So it's named after this brilliant German psychologist called Hedwig von Restorff. And back in 1933, she runs her classic experiment. She gives the participants long lists of information. So say a page of A4 with, let's say 30 lines. And on each line, there are three letters, TCY or NTU. And she goes on three letters down this page. But then sooner or later, she throws in three numbers, say 164. And then she goes back to letters again. She then she gives people a few minutes to read these lists. She then takes the lists away and she asks the participants to recall as much as they possibly can. And her key finding is that if you give people long lists of letters, they mainly remember the distinctive numbers. Whereas if you give them long lists of mainly numbers, they remember the distinctive letters. We are hardwired to notice what is distinctive. So this became known as the von Restorff effect or the isolation effect. Now, that study was 1933. So people often say, well, what's that got to do with marketing today? You know, consumers have changed so much, technology's changed so much. Can we really give these older findings any credibility? But the general finding is that people's psychological triggers are remarkably consistent. What works in 1933 works in 2021, it'll probably work in 2121. These fundamentals don't really change. Now, don't take my word on that. There are certainly more recent experiments rerunning the von Restorff effect, but I'll give you instead a bit of a live demonstration. So have a look at the screen, and I'm going to show you a poster for a genuine American heavy metal festival. So here it is. The wonderfully named Bay Area Death Fest 2. And when people first look at this, what they tend to notice is one of two things. People either notice that big band at the top, Origin, or their attention is just drawn, it's sucked in towards those people down the bottom right, Party Can. Now, Party Can, I think, realised something that eludes 90% of brands. What most brands do is either on their general advertising, they cling to category convention, or on a web page, they will often have an undifferentiated mass of information. Now, if in your advertising you cling to category convention, or you just don't differentiate details on a website, what you're essentially doing is behaving like one of these spidery squiggles. You're becoming essentially invisible. If you don't behave distinctively, you don't get noticed. Now, what I think is interesting here is many people, many individuals in marketing know the importance of distinctiveness. So you could say, well, what's behavioral science telling us? But even though we know about the power of distinctiveness, we often don't act upon it. And I think there the danger is that often we will talk about distinctiveness as a creative decision or an act of bravery, that's bad psychology. I think when clients hear that, they think risky. They think, I don't want to go anywhere near that. Where behavioural science becomes really useful is it gives us a more authoritative way of persuading our clients or persuading other people within the business. Because rather than telling people to take a risk, be brave, what you can say is, look, here's a peer-reviewed academic paper, here's the experiment, here's the data, and suddenly it becomes a very sensible, balanced, non-risky decision to behave distinctively. So that's the von Restorff effect, sometimes known as the isolation effect. But it's this argument that if you want to be noticed, make sure you behave distinctively. Now, when we get to questions later, if people are interested in this as a tactic, there's also a lovely nuance called the red sneaker effect. So it's a related bias. And that argues that not only do you get noticeability if you break conventions, you also have higher status. So if that's of interest, maybe we can come back to that as an idea. But now we've grabbed our customers' attention, let's move on to the next bit, which is, well, how do you steer their attention to the product that you want? And again, there are lots of experiments in this area. One of my favorites is an idea called extremeness aversion. So this is data from an agency called Mountain View, and it features in a brilliant book by Phil Barden called Decoded. And what happens here is they set up a bar and they sell two beers. So they sell mainstream Carling for £1 and they sell a fancy premium beer, Budvar, for £2. And when they do that, a third of people buy Carling and 2/3 buy Budvar. So remember those numbers: 1/3 Carling, 2/3 Budvar. That's kind of benchmark. Next, they introduce a third, and I hope Tesco don't mind, but a third low quality beer here, Tesco Value Lager for 20p. Now, literally 0 people, no one buys Tesco Value Lager. But what's fascinating is even though no one buys that product, the ratio between Carling and Budvar changes. Rather than a third of people buying Carling, we now have just under half. 47% of people buy Carling, 53% buy Budvar. Now, just to check this finding isn't a rogue one, psychologists get rid of Tesco Value Lager, and now they introduce a super premium beer, Kronenbourg Blanc, for £4. Now, that's very expensive. It's 4 times the price of Carling, so only a small amount of people buy Kronenbourg Blanc, just 10%. But again, this ratio between Carling and Budvar changes. Now, no one buys Carling and 90% buy Budvar. The psychologists call this extremeness aversion. It's not just something that happens in beer, it's seen in electronic goods, in cinema popcorn sales, coffee shop, coffee sales. Again and again, when people pick a product, they don't just base their decision on the inherent attributes of that product. Of course, that's important, but they're also weighing up the relative position of the brand. If it's the cheapest of those available, so in the bar scenario, people worry it's going to be poor quality and they might look like a miser. Whereas if it's the most expensive one, they might worry that they're overpaying and they'll look like a show-off. So people gravitate towards the middle. Now, even if the middle is a very different brand, that's the key point. It's the position that is almost as important as the inherent attributes. So this is called extremeness aversion, sometimes the Goldilocks effect, sometimes the center stage effect. So if you're a brand, this is a really relevant experiment. What you should think is if you have a basic product and a premium product, and you want to encourage more people to buy the premium product, one way to do that, without giving away any margin, without giving any extra benefit to that premium product, is to launch a super premium one. So, if you look at Tide, look at their website. What they've done is added a what they call the premium card for $49.99. The presence of that isn't just valuable in the direct sales it makes, it's also has a value in shifting people away from the free option to the £9.99 plus option. Now, if you do this as an approach, you've got to be a little bit careful about how you measure it. Because what I think sometimes brands do is they introduce that super high-end option. They see it doesn't really sell very much and they think it's a failure and therefore they remove it. But that's a blinkered view of its value. It's not just the direct sales. Measure those, but also measure that uplift from the basic to the premium package. Now, again, people could say, well, you know, quite a lot of websites do this. If you go on a charity site, if you go on a lot of service sites, you see people offering 3 options. So what's, again, behavioural science adding? Well, firstly, not everyone does this. So I think it's news to some people. But then secondly, when people do this, they often apply some findings from behavioural science, but not as many findings as they could. And one area that people often don't apply is something called the order effect. So I'm going to jump to a slightly different experiment that psychologist Nick Kalender often talks about. And this is based on the work of Suckley and Lichtenstein. And they set up a test in a bar over 8 weeks. And this is a fancy bar. When people come in, they're given a menu of beers. And sometimes they list those 13 beers from cheapest at the top down to most expensive at the bottom. And when they do that, the average sale is $5.78. But on other occasions, other drinkers come in and they are given a different menu. It's got exactly the same beers, and each beer is exactly the same price, but they've flipped the order. So now when they come in, the most expensive beer is at the top. And in that scenario, the average price goes up by, or the average sale goes up by 4%. So to $6.02. Now, what the psychologists argue is happening here is a version of anchoring. Now, if you have a high-priced product, you essentially, like we've seen in the previous example, you are shifting people's willingness to pay. But what Suckley and Lichtenstein show is that it's not just the presence of a high price that matters, what's called anchoring. It's the order in which you see that high price that also matters. The biggest impact is if you see the price as the first thing you encounter. So with menus, most people read top to bottom. If you see $4 first, by the time you've got down to $5 or $6, you're thinking about, well, I'm paying £1 more or $1 more than I could do elsewhere. Whereas if you see $10 as the first thing, it's a slightly different shift in perception. By the time you're getting down to $7 or $6, you're thinking, oh, I'm saving $3, I'm saving $4. And it's that subtle shift that boosts willingness to pay. Now, it's not a huge shift, but it is a statistically significant one, and it is an extra 24 cents on a beer. And what's interesting for marketers is there's absolutely no cost in doing this. You've got to order your menu one way or the other. So you might as well order it in a way that best taps into behavioural science. So if we look at something like Tide, they had low price, medium price, high price. Because we tend to read left to right, they would not be applying this idea. And that's what most brands do. But you do see one or two applying it. I think this is Boots Mobile. Apologies, I've got the brand wrong. But this is a rare example of someone applying the order effect. So not only having a nice expensive package to make the 20 gig and the 15 gig look a bit better value, but also applying this order effect. So the first thing that you encounter reading left to right is the most expensive one, and that will tap into this idea and boost people's willingness to pay just a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, we did some testing sort of in a similar area to this that actually ended up being, really successful. This was actually for a company called Hippo Bag, who almost like an alternative to skips, if you like. You might have seen them when you go into home base with B&Q. You can buy this big yellow bag, chuck it outside the front of your house, and put all your rubbish in it, and they come with a big grabber and take it away for you, basically. So we were helping them do a lot of sort of optimization on their site. And well, one of the learnings not related to this, but when we were trying to get people are rubbish at estimating is one of the things that we learned. We tried lots of ways to work out how we could show the size of that bag. Turns out the best way to do it is to put a human in it, which is still one of my favorite findings. But yeah, we were amazed at how well this worked when we were testing the different options between buying the bag only, which in this instance is sort of 12 quid, versus buying the bag and collection at the same time, which is the middle option, or doing it independently, buying the bag first and then coming back when you filled it up, and buying the collection later. We played around with lots of different layouts for this, but it turned out that actually, again, the middle option was the one that really did convert much better than the other two. And it was a really solid finding, I think.
Yeah.
Sort of, what's that really?
And a lovely use of charm pricing as well,
yes.
rather than round pricing. Oh, fantastic. And that's the brilliant thing that I think sometimes people think about behavioural science as this academic, complicated subject, but it doesn't have to be. The experiments, when you boil them down, are super simple, and then they've got this very relevant, very practical implication, as you've just shown.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, final theme, and for this one, which is about reducing churn, let me just stop the share for a second, and then let me reshare, because I don't know if other people have found this, but what I've found is with Zoom, if you optimize the screen for video, you get these weird black boxes appear sometimes. So you might have to put up with those just for a few minutes. So I want to play a video now, and well, let's start with a video, and I'll then explain why it's relevant. Now, when you first start watching it, it might not seem that relevant, but I promise you, bear with me, and it will all become clear.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So I'm playing that video for you, partly because I love that video, but also what's interesting here is it shows how much of a driver, certainly in monkeys to begin with, fairness is. And if you think about it, the monkey's behavior is what an economist would say is illogical. You know, that they were happy with the payment of giving one rock over for one cucumber originally, but when they know someone else is getting a little bit more, suddenly they are enraged, they're incandescent. And I played you this because when I think you see a bias or a trait that happens in both, you know, animals with a common ancestor and ourselves, you know they are really deep rooted. You know they're really powerful drivers of behavior. And that's not just speculation. That's not just speculation that humans are also affected by this idea. So I'll take you through a study from Blount and Baseman. And it's a really nice experiment because it involves a lovely bit of subterfuge. So the psychologists go up to students and they ask them whether they would be willing to take part in an experiment. So say they've got to do half an hour's worth of maths puzzles. Now the subterfuge is that there is no maths puzzles, there is no experiment. All Blount and Baseman are interested in is who agrees to take part. And one setting, they offer the students $7. And students being students, especially, I think this was 1998, so it's quite a long time ago, it's quite a decent amount of pay. Nearly 3/4 of them agreed to take part. So that's the kind of the benchmark. Next group of people, and it's always a different group, it's never the same people with a different offer. This is a different group, so they haven't been exposed to that original offer. The psychologists go up to those students and say, would you do these maths puzzles, take you half an hour, and we'll pay you $8. So they're offering them $1 more. But the catch is they lie to the students and they say, look, we're really sorry. We were offering people early this morning $10. Now, again, we've got a situation like the monkeys here, the capturing monkeys. If people are logical value maximizers, what others are getting paid is irrelevant. What they should just be thinking is it worth giving up my time for $7 or $8? But that's not how people behave. Even though this group is offered more money, there's a drop of about 25% in participation. It goes down to 54% of people being willing to take part. So what Blount and Baseman argue is when it comes to financial motivations, it's not just the price or the offer or the wage that matters, it's the perceived degree of fairness. Now, this all might sound a little abstract, but think about, I don't know, probably 70 or 80% of checkout journeys. What do you tend to see just before you're about to put your credit card details in? What you normally see is something like this big box saying, put in your promotional code, put in your discount code. Now, if you do that, you're running a real risk of transgressing these fairness norms. We see how much that aggravates people. Someone might have been completely happy with the price that you're offering. They might have thought it was an amazing deal. But when they see that discount box, that tells them other people are getting an even better deal. And suddenly they're enraged or they're at least irritated. They go off and try and find those discounts. They probably won't be able to get them. And some of them may never come back. So the suggestion here would be, whatever you're doing, try and avoid transgressing these fairness norms. You might think about only showing these promotional code boxes to people that you've sent a specific link to on your email programming. Or you might change the design of the website so it's not a giant box, but it's a much more subtle link. Working on the theory that if someone has one of these codes, they'll be looking for the place to put it in, or if someone doesn't have the code, they'll be a little less vigilant.
Yeah, I think with those as well, you can also really celebrate the fact, around sort of bank holiday weekends and things like that. Some of the camping providers do a really awesome job of this, where they really, have that promotional code heroed across the whole site, and it works really well in terms of just getting that time-dependent purchase, but sharing it for everyone.
Yeah, so I've certainly seen some sites where if you try and put in a promotional code and it fails a couple of times, they offer you quite a low discount. But often that's I think enough to get around this fairness transaction point, because I don't know what other people have been given. It might be that some people have got a 50% one out there, but if I'm given just 2 or 3%, at least I feel I'm one of those lucky ones.
This is one of those ones that it's still, I think you go around e-commerce experiences and you see this far too often, where, it just on the face of it is unfair, isn't it? And it's such an obvious quick win, but still very prevalent out there, I think, in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think I suppose that comes, takes us back to some of the benefits of behavioural science. That, sometimes there are completely new findings that people probably don't know about, like this order effect. It's quite different from how most people behave. Yet on other occasions, there are some of these findings that people might know about, but not have the confidence to push through internally because they feel a little bit bizarre. I guess the great thing about behavioural science is it gives you this ammunition to persuade, the CFO or the head of whichever department you need to win over, that there is merit in investing time and money to make the subtle tweaks to the web pages. So hopefully, we've only done a very rapid run through of some of the findings from behavioural science, but hopefully it gives everyone a bit of an idea that these two topics can be combined very profitably. And yeah, I guess if there's any questions that we've delivered from that, I guess now's the time to start asking them.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions
Cool.
that have come in. Please, if you guys have more, fire them in, and we'll do our best to get through them. So I think there's a couple of interesting ones, Rich. One where someone's asking, do you think customers are actually starting to become more aware of these tactics?
Well, that's an interesting one. So there have been a couple of studies which have looked at being much more transparent about nudging. So I won't get the details quite right because it's a while ago I looked at it, but it was essentially I think it was a charity site did a test where they ran a control page, like donate what you want, a hidden nudge, make a donation. Some people like to donate £100. That's essentially using anchoring. You throw out this huge number to shift people's perception of what's a reasonable amount to donate upwards. And that saw a big increase in donation levels. And then they had what they call a transparent nudge, which was, make a donation. Some people donate £100. Please be aware that knowing this can affect others' donation levels. And there they saw, I think the performance in that tranche was slightly lower than the hidden nudge, but not much, and still significantly higher on the control. And I think that general principle of nudges having longevity is probably a decent rule of thumb, because if you think about some of these ideas, they are useful to the consumer as well as the brand. One big theme in behavioural science is social proof, this idea that we pick what other people are picking, or we behave in a way that's in line with our group. Now, for hundreds of thousands of years through our evolutionary history, that was an amazing survival tactic. Now, if everyone else ran, it was probably good for your survival if you copied them rather than making your own independent judgment. Now, and jump forward to 2021, it's still a very useful behavior. It helps people decide very quickly. If you're walking down the supermarket and you're faced with 150 shampoos, which is the more sensible behavior, to weigh up the merits of each of those shampoos, or just to pick the middle price one, or to pick the most popular one? People adopt these behaviors sometimes because actually the trade-off is in their favor, that it allows them to choose quickly. And even if it doesn't get the supposedly objective best selection, well, they'd prefer the speed and ease of picking. So generally, I think these nudges will maintain their consistency even if people know about them. I think, though, with all this stuff, you've got to, be sensible. And where you might find it doesn't work, going back to some of the travel comparison sites, if you've created something that the consumer actually felt slightly mugged off by, that I would not be so certain that would keep on working. So if you've created this kind of almost false sense of panic through social proof and scarcity, then if people keep on going back, that might begin to backfire.
Okay, great. So James is asking that you mentioned the red sneaker concept.
Yeah.
Has got him intrigued.
Yeah.
You elaborate a little bit for us.
Oh yeah, cool. So I was a bit worried about time there, so I thought maybe just mention it, but we could always come back to if people were interested. So there's the von Restorff effect, which says if you are distinctive, you become noticeable, and that's reasonably well known. There's a lesser known finding from a Harvard Business School psychologist called Francesca Gino. She wrote a wonderful book called Rebel Ideas that covers this and other research she's done. And her idea is that if you break a convention, you are seen as higher status. So she does loads of experiments in this area. The first one was in 2011, where she goes to an academic conference where there is a strong social norm to dress smartly. And as these academics are arriving, Gino notes down how smart or scruffy they are on this 7-point scale. And then after she's done that, she goes and later finds the academics and asks them how many citations they have. So one citation is an academic has been referenced once in another peer-reviewed paper. So the more citations you have, the more successful you are. Slightly crude metric, but kind of useful one. And what Gino finds is there is a inverse correlation between the number of citations an academic has and their smartness of dress. So the super successful academics are dressing scruffily or more likely to dress scruffily. The junior academics are dressing much more smartly. They're abiding by the convention of dress. Now, Gino argues this is because it takes, in her words, social capital to break a convention. If you are powerless and you break a convention, you will be punished. If you're powerful and you break a convention, people put up with it. So what she argues and shows in her later experiments is people are remarkably well attuned to this. So if we see someone purposely breaking a convention, we assume they're higher status. So that to me is maybe a second reason why brands should behave distinctively, why they should consider breaking their conventions. Not only do they get noticed, but also they'll be perceived as prestigious, high status.
Okay, great. Right, so should we do one last question then? I think in terms of sort of time, because we're sort of getting close to our wrapping up. So I think there's another question for another James about comparison sites, actually, asking about how they offer quite a very sterile table that all look quite familiar, similar in terms of their presentation of quotes and so on. He's asking, does this encourage people just to look at the price, or is it possible to nudge in this environment?
So we certainly know that it's possible to nudge in the environment. That Llewellyn Norton was essentially a nudge on a comparison site where they slowed down the speed at which people saw the results, and that made people appreciate the comprehensiveness of the service a bit more. But I think you could do loads more. I think that it's almost designed to push people towards the cheapest price, which interestingly people are often quite resistant to. People don't often pick the cheapest price because I think there is a rule of thumb in people's minds that price equates with quality. So low price, low quality, high price, high quality. That's not speculation. There's a Baba Shiv study where he serves people wine. So it's 5 different bottles of wine, each with a price label on. But the twist is that there's only actually 4 different liquids. So one of the wines is repeated. So people are drinking a glass of wine thinking it's $5 and then rating it. And then a few minutes later, they'll drink the same liquid, but they think it's $45. And Shivs shows that the ratings of that wine are 70% higher when people think it's a $45 bottle of wine. So we definitely have this situation where people assume high price equates to high quality, and those assumptions affect our actual experience. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think alongside that, there are certainly biases you could use in that environment. I mean, it's quite interesting. I don't think any of them use social proof. It would probably be quite useful for the customer to know which is the most popular option. And it would probably be in the interest of the comparison site as well, because it would steer people to something with a higher margin, steer them away from the very cheapest option. So absolutely, I think you could apply biases to that environment.
Yeah. Okay. I think the other thing interesting in that environment, from when we've ever looked at lists with brands, is to say, for example, in that comparison, you're always going to have, I know Direct Line on those sites, a bad example, but other insurance companies, it's amazing the power in terms of how people scan that brand list as well, as we've seen. So it's an interesting opportunity to maybe use price might not be the first point they're actually looking at, and what content you've got next to the brands is also, quite differentiating, especially if it's things around value add. It might be around the environment or so on, and things like that, for example. So I think there are other points that people naturally gravitate in terms of looking to, not just price that you can leverage.
Yeah, it's almost like the choice architecture is forcing people to just look at price, whereas actually, they'd quite like other variables to draw as well. I guess the challenge there is trying to avoid this problem of choice paralysis. That there are some studies that show that if you offer people too many choices, it becomes onerous. They can throw their hands up and walk away. But that's why maybe, again, like social proof is so useful, because particularly for people who are of a very low involvement, you're giving them a much easier way to pick from that huge variety.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, cool. Well, look, Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that was a really great presentation, a really, really awesome discussion. So thank you so much. Lots of questions about the recording and so on. So we'll be adding it. We'll put it up on our site, tangent.co.uk. You'll be able to find it on there. And yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Have a great day or evening wherever you are in the world.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.